and we're going to talk about issue framing, which again is a good classroom exercise and a good process to kind of have groups. And I talked about my class yesterday that it's almost like a semester project, that their final project for the semester after spending all semester on a topic is one of these discussion guides. But this is also something that can be a much shorter project, right, that you're doing. So we're going to get the basics, a true issue framing workshop that teach you how to do this kind of on a public issue out there in the public is going to be much longer, right? But in terms of an academic exercise in a class, I think we got an hour and a half here, or 2 hours that we kind of play with this. So that's it. Yeah, so I got a few more slides here with this, and then we'll have a little exercise here that I'll do in a little bit. So this is the broader steps if I was doing it as a public process, right? So then doing it in class, you'll recognize that there'll be certain steps that you kind of skip in a sense as we go. But I'll walk through these really quickly, and then the presentation kind of walk through a little more slowly. So first, you need to identify a public issue right for deliberation. And what I mean, I have a slide here in a second about what rightness in a sense. It's another concept that we're kind of developing. But some issues are technical issues, right? I'm not going to have a deliberation about how we should build a bridge, right? That's a pretty scientific kind of technical issue in a sense, right? So there are certain issues that might be too technical or specific. So obviously the easiest way to think about it, an issue right for deliberation is a wicked problem, right? Each different side is coming from a different perspective, and each side has a pretty good kind of support to it. Now I've struggled with some issues that my students are passionate about. We have a teacher in our department that's really passionate about human trafficking issues, right? And it's not a wicked issue in a traditional sense. I don't think that people that are doing human trafficking have good values, right? Yeah. But what should we do about human trafficking? There's some tensions about what's the best way to kind of deal with it, right? So we can kind of still engage it as an issue, but it's not quite a deliberation issue in the true sense of a wicked problem, right? So we'll talk more about that in a second. So then once you get a good issue that kind of fits the model, then you identify the underlying values and concerns, right? So I've talked a lot about that, and we've done that. Right? What are the values underneath these, and what are the tensions between them? So the water map I showed you, right? And then after each of the processes we've done, we've talked about what are the key values, what are the values underlying this that we talked about. That's the framework, the lens that you use. Then you name the issue. So what's the title? What's going to be on your flyer? Or what's going to be on the issue book, right? We had one of them was shaping our future. I think the other example I did is what should we do about childhood obesity? I tend to like the title being a question. That what should we do about X? With X being, a frame broadly that everyone agrees it's a problem, right? There's lots of different ways, and I'll show you lots of examples. And I'm going to pass around the other examples that you brought. The other books. Where did they go? She just brought some more.
They're on your table right behind you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And y'all are welcome to grab after you look at them. Those are
yeah, and she's got a few. It's an old catalog, but it still gives you a sense of how they frame different issues.
They have that online too. All of these are online.
Yeah, this is the NIF. At the end, I think one of the slides has a link to a lot of these issue books, right? One of them being an NIF. So I was going to pass these. You can kind of grab one and look at it. But they're all the same kind of model. Here's a problem, and then here's 3 approaches. Sometimes 4 approaches on how to solve it, right? So you name the overall issue. You get a good name that everyone's going to agree with. It's not going to turn anyone off. I know that NIF was trying to develop one on global warming, but they realized once they really started engaging the issue, they wanted to kind of get everyone involved in that conversation. Maybe not kind of strict deniers, but at least kind of conservatives. And they realized that they called it global warming, it only kind of spoke to some people, right? It ended up reframing it in a sense of, how do we kind of ensure energy security in a way, right? So by talking about energy security, kind of opened up the conversation that broadened the audience. That's always going to be a choice. If we're thinking a little bit, we might play as a group with this homelessness issue. What I've done some work with, and getting your name out. Ben, yeah. Ben is interested in it, so it might be kind of an issue for us to play with in a sense. But if we're going to design an issue, a homelessness discussion guide, are we designing it for all audiences? Like the people that think homeless, are just individuals that make bad choices, or is it more for people that care about homelessness and want to do it? Is it a tool for them to really think through the issues, right? And that's kind of one of the how strategic are you designing it, how broad you want the audience is a choice, right? Then you develop the potential approaches, right? So that's when you develop the 3 approaches, right? And that's really the big reframing, because you're getting away from a pro-con, yes-no framing to at least 3, right? And then once you have the 3 approaches, then you start filling in blanks. For each approach, you want some specific actions. You saw that kind of in the examples we've used. You want some arguments for it, also some arguments against. You want to identify some trade-offs, and probably some key discussion questions, right? So you kind of lay it out. And then you research and refine the approaches. If I was developing it, it's very rare that I'll develop a book and we use it in the public. I normally develop it and I test it, right? I test it with my students. I test it with some specific groups. I let other groups vet it. Right? With the river stuff, we developed it and then we shared it with a lot of these river groups to let them push back. Because we wanted, once we actually took it in the community, for it to be approved, right? And all the different sides felt this was a fair document. And then you have a framework, right? Looks like you're gonna have a question standing over there.
When you're framing, do you figure out the approaches yourself, or do you use surveys?
It depends on time.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, if it's a public process, the more you can make the development of the framework a public process, the better.
Yeah.
Right. So I'll talk about that. But then sometimes I don't have enough time. So sometimes I need to research it. The question becomes, well, we'll get to it.
Yeah.
As we kind of go through, because identifying the underlying values and concerns is: are you doing that, or are you doing a process to do it? Is essentially the question, right?
My question: How
Yeah.
big is framing group? What's the best?
How
big should be the framing group? I suppose it's you.
like in terms of a class, or
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's. I think like when NIF does it, when they develop these national books, they probably have a pretty big group, right? I know we're in the middle of one that's developing it for substance abuse kind of issues, and it's probably about a group of 15 or so from lots of different communities. In my classes, I do a group of 4. There's a group project in a sense, because there's a lot of research involved in it. But I'm imagining it also, I mean, I've created something just by myself, right? That we have an issue that kind of happens, we want a reaction. I knew enough about the issue, so I'm able to kind of put it together kind of on my own in a sense. So it kind of, I think the more the better, but the more is going to take more time, and it's that collaboration kind of thing, right? So yeah, I don't know if there's a direct answer to that in a sense. So I don't want to walk through all of this, you have it in there, but that question of what issues fit this, right? I've said no to quite a few projects that people come to me because of some of these red flags. Part of the question is, will getting people in the room to talk about this be productive or unproductive? I've had a lot of people ask me to do fracking, that we need to have a meeting about fracking. I spent a summer with some research for some graduate students trying to frame fracking, and we realized with it that there's just very little information that both sides agree with. Like both sides just have a completely different set of data, and both sides have so little distrust of each other. I'm like, if we get people in the room to talk about fracking, it's like they'll just yell it. I mean, there's no basis, there's just not enough common ground to change that conversation yet, right? I kind of said no to that, right? So there's some issues that don't fit this very well, or just not ripe enough. They're not ready yet for deliberation. But most of the issues that we tackled, there's normally an angle that we can do, right? So the signs of ripeness, green flag, and I'm not saying if you have a red flag, stop. It's just you've got lots of red flags. So does it primarily involve tensions between positive values, right? So if each side has some positive values, then that's something you can really work with, right? When it's more of a zero sum, that automatically what's good for one side is bad for the other side, that's going to be harder to have a deliberative thing. I was asked by my university, have y'all banned smoking on campus yet?
Yeah, well, they have to go outside. I think there's a smoking area, right?
Smoking area. Okay, yeah. So about 1,100 campuses have banned smoking altogether.
Okay.
Like no smoking on campus whatsoever, right? So our campus wanted to look at that, and at first I thought it would be a deliberative, but then I realized this is the majority deliberating about the action of a minority, right? And it's a bad behavior that the minority are doing that the majority wants to control. So there's really, for the people that don't smoke, they're not giving anything up to have this policy, So then I realized once we started getting into it, it's like this isn't really something to deliberate, right? What do we do with these small groups in a way? Because there's not a reciprocity, there's not a balance in a sense, right? So that's one way. The second, right, is all major stakeholder groups realize the need for action. That desperation can actually be an asset, right? Deliberation works best when everyone realizes the status quo is not working. We need to do something, right? If there's people that particularly prefer the status quo, especially if they're powerful people, deliberation's a little harder, right? If people are the dysfunction, the problem is good for some people, right? So that's when we're talking about activism and kind of dealing with power relationships. Deliberation might not always be the best tool in some sense, right? Unless you're getting those groups to kind of agree to the deliberation. Need for broad action by many stakeholders. This kind of is the smoking thing, right? It's best when whatever results, whatever actions come up, it's broad range of action. Going back to the democratic governance, right? There's role for individuals, there's role for nonprofits, for private industry. Yeah, there's some policy change, right? There's lots of potential action, and that gives you a lot to work with, right? It's very hard to do a deliberation by a referendum issue, right? If it's a yes or no, pass this law or not, it's very hard to have a very rich deliberation, because you're really only coming up with a yes or no answer. Right? Actually, so end of life issues, right? There was a big controversy last few months of a little woman that moved to Oregon that had brain cancer. I don't know if y'all saw that issue at all, right? So Oregon has a law, a right to die law, so she can actually get poison from her doctor to end her life. She had a form of brain cancer that really changes her personality. Right, so she didn't want to continue living because she didn't want all her family to kind of remember her once it really kind of changes her completely. Right, so she chose to take her own life. So our state legislature for Fort Collins brought that same law to Colorado, right? And then she wanted us to run meetings. This was like literally 2 weeks ago, right? And it's like it's hard for me to run a meeting on a specific law, right? Because people have more vested interest and they don't move their deliberation is all about refining and changing your opinion. And if it's a yes no on a law, that's you're switching from yes to no versus being flexible along a continuum, right? Just today I read in the paper that it didn't make it out of committee, right? So it's not going to be a law that legislators vote on. So now I can do a process, right? So now let's have a conversation in our community about end of life, with the broad ideas of what we could do, right? Now my community will be educated on it. Next year, she can bring the law again, right? But the fact that the law didn't make it out of committee, or the bill didn't make it out of committee, actually helps me, right? Because now we're not constrained to frame it as a yes/no question on that specific law.
I think deliberation can be is an element of blocking
Yeah, I just think it's better earlier in the process, right? Deliberation is better to kind of think about the problem and potential actions. When we get to the point that we're voting yes or no on a law, it's framed so narrowly, right? Not only is it framed so narrowly, but the winners and losers are clear, right? It's very, we took on this stadium. The stadium issue has been my most difficult issue. So CSU has a football team like all American colleges, right? And our stadium is 3 miles away, right? On the foothills, but it's old and it needs a lot of work. But by not having a stadium on campus, right, the advantage of having a stadium on campus is every time you have a football game, 30,000 people, a lot of your alumni, come to campus. Right? They walk around their campus and they see their dorm room and they go see their department. So for alumni relationships, having people on campus is huge, right? So the new athletic director and new president said, we're going to build a new stadium that's going to be on campus. All hell breaks loose, right? We're a very environmentally conscious university in Colorado, right? So to build a second stadium, right, and to use campus space for a stadium, and to spend $200 million on a stadium when faculty haven't gotten raises and all. Now, the $200 million is going to be raised, right? It's not university funds, but still the symbolism of it. So it's a huge controversy. So the president of the university asked me to help run meetings about the stadium. But again, it was a yes-no issue, right? And so it was really hard for us to have a good conversation. Now, people against the stadium, it's very unlikely, and they're so against the stadium, for them to move their opinion when all I'm really asking, are you for it or against it? Right? But if we would have done it earlier, right, if we wanted to have a deliberation about the role of athletics at the university, or, then we could have had a conversation. But once we decided it was already kind of put on the table to be a yes/no, it makes it really hard to have a really robust deliberation about it. Right? One exception to that, I think about how much this is worth talking about. So the citizens jury, right, is a process, and we've done this, and it's worked pretty well. Colorado and some states have a lot of referendum issues, right? So they put voters, they put some vote to the voters, right? So the example of the change in the education funding in Colorado was referendum issue. Go to the voters and they can vote yes or no, right? So the state of Oregon has what's called a Citizens Initiative Review. Now, what they do is every year they take 1 or 2 issues that are going up for referendum and they have a grant to do this. They get, I think, 20 people to serve on a jury for a week, normally 4 or 5 full days, to study the issue. And it's like a court case. They're a jury. They bring the advocates for and against it in as witnesses. They bring experts in to kind of answer questions, and then they deliberate, right? And then they call more experts, just like a jury trial. Like we call people back and ask them questions, and the advocates for and against referendum issues kind of give opening statements, and then make their case, and then give closing statements. And then they deliberate again with the facilitator. Then they vote as a group who's for the referendum and who's against the referendum. Once they vote, they split, and then each side writes a 1-page summary of why are we for this or why are we against this, based on 4 days of talking through it, right? In Oregon, they passed it through the state legislature that those 2 pages actually go into the voting guide, right? So the voting guide that gets mailed to every single citizen, right, here's a 2-page summary of a group of random citizens that spent 5 days studying this, their opinion. So that's one example. We play with that a little bit with the yes/no issue in a sense. That you get this group, so then you're having, because most of the information for referendum is these 30-second spot ads or horrible kind of slick mailers and things like that frame the issue, in a very strategic, manipulative way. But this is an example of, a group of citizens spending a lot of time really thinking through the tensions and negotiating and all those kind of things and coming up with why they like it. Right? So helps when there's a broad middle, right? That there's lots of people that don't know enough about the issue or kind of see the different sides of the issue. It's more difficult when the issue is dominated by very kind of entrenched voices. Right? So in most cases, the entrenched voices are the loudest voices, but there's ways of getting out of their voices, right? But for some issues, the only people that care about it are going to be very strong-willed people. Well, then it's not going to be a very useful process, right? It's actually a green flag when there's a lot of misunderstandings across the perspective, but there's some trust, right? Because we can change that with good information, with a good process. We fix those misunderstandings, right? So it's okay if there's a lot of, if there's a big gap between the public and the experts. Okay, that's rightness. We can change that gap if they trust the organization in a sense. But if there's this is the fracking thing. If there's significant distrust, if anything that comes out of people's mouths they don't believe is true, that's very hard to change people's minds. And then significant resources, if you actually have, be able to have meetings and have food at the meetings and have facilitators and those type of things, obviously that helps, right? Now that's kind of public, but that also helps in the sense of, if your students are going to do these projects, like pick a topic that's controversial, pick a topic that there's different sides to, right? That there's not a scientific solution, or there's not kind of a clear right and wrong kind of in there, that you want to pick one that the different sides have, right? So that's kind of that first step is identify right. Then you have to identify the values and concerns. And there's lots of ways of doing this. This goes back to the cycle of deliberation that I showed you yesterday. It's on one of your slides, right? So the first step is deliberative issue analysis, like at 12 o'clock. And then you do convening, then you facilitate, then you report, and actions in the middle. So that deliberative issue analysis, I think these are very useful assignments for students. Because again, you're not telling them, pick a position and then go find evidence of that position, right? Which is too easy to do with so much information out there on the internet, right? What you're saying is pick a topic and you're going to learn kind of the different sides of that topic. Your job, again, as an expert is to lay out the choices that we have, right? So the deliberative issue analysis is you're not searching for evidence of a preconceived opinion. You're searching for ideas to take on a tough issue, right? So it is, in deliberative issue analysis, it combines kind of public research with expert research and scientific research. Right? Coming from a deliberative perspective, you start more with the public. Your goal is to change the public conversation, so you kind of have to start with the public. You start with how is the public understanding this issue? How do they talk about how they care about this issue? What ideas do they have? And then you back it up with expert data to figure out where's the public right and where's the public wrong. Right? And it's one of those issues that the public's thinking about it in a really bad way. And when you look at the experts, then that's something to know, right? That part of the process has to be to educate the public in some senses. Right? But instead of starting with the experts and then going to the public, you're starting with the public in some ways to really understand how the public's thinking about that. Right. So sometimes significant examples of public discourse exist. Sometimes I'm asked to do a project, and I know I can, like I talked about yesterday, I can find a couple articles online that have 150 comments. I'm just starting with my campus on campus climate, kind of civility issues on campus, and issues of diversity and inclusion on campus. And there have been so many examples of that it's pretty easy for me to research it. Right? So if there's data out there, if there's just public comment out there already, or if it's been an issue in front of city council, our city council meetings are videotaped, right? So like when fracking, an example, when the city asked me if I could help with fracking, the first thing they did is they sent me all the emails that have been sent to city council about fracking. Right? So they sent me like 600 emails. And then they had one meeting at city council that fracking was kind of a focus area. And about 75 people spoke at it, so I can go online and see that. Okay, what's the public? So I can start getting a sense of how the public's talking about it. Right? Interestingly, out of the 350 emails or something like that, about 120 of them with the exact same email. Right? So it was basically an environmental group that sent an email out and said, "Hey, cut and paste this email and send it to city council." Right? And it was actually the most extreme email. Right? That way it was framed and the wording and but yeah, I was reading through them all. I'm like, I think I've read this before. Right? I've read this one before, and I counted. It was 120 years ago. The exact same. So sometimes there's enough public discourse, like for a student assignment, they can just research it, right? They just gotta find, and they can go to activist websites, right? So you're finding public kind of sentiment on this. And then sometimes you have to develop yourself. So there's a question you asked earlier for Wendy, right? So sometimes you have, and if sometimes the students can do campus projects, right? Something on a campus issue that they're dealing with, and they can do a survey. So I had to do surveys in my own class of asking people what they want, right? So sometimes I had to do survey data to get an idea of it. It's typically not scientific. We're not doing a full, again, money-wise, I don't have money to kind of pay a survey firm to get a representative sample and things like that. Right. In some cases you do, but I'm not specifically trying to find out exactly how the opinion is. I just want example. What are the arguments being made? What are the assumptions of what's being made? Obviously, the more scientific you make it, the better in some senses, but that's really expensive. Obviously, our average students do a scientific sample. So these are the kind of questions we ask if we do a survey. Again, we're just trying to get a sense of how people think about this issue. When we do this training, I'm part of the Kettering Foundations. We have a Center for Public Life, and people starting centers like mine, and we do this training a year round. We have 4 meetings over the year face-to-face, and we issue frame together. We do one big issue book that becomes an official NIF book. We're doing substance abuse this semester. So we came up with a survey kind of like this about substance abuse, and then we all went home, and I think each person had to get 100 different surveys, whether that was handwritten or online or through their classes. We did an exercise, we'll just do it in a second, brainstorming stakeholders, who cares about this issue. So then we wanted to make sure we got surveys to all the different groups and those type of things. But all this kind of raw data is used to help build the book, to get a sense of how people are thinking about it. So when I talk about the deliberative inquiry, there's 4 kind of key things that I'm always looking for. If my goal as a deliberative practitioner is to improve the conversation, these are 4 kind of data points that specifically I'm looking for to try to improve the conversation. And you start getting a sense of this from analyzing the existing public discourse or analyzing the surveys. So obstacles are what makes it hard to talk about this subject. Right? One way when I think about obstacles is what do I want to deal with before the meeting? Like if there's personality disputes, if there's a lot of misunderstanding, if each side has completely different factual sets, if there's whatever's kind of going on in a sense, I can take care of beforehand, right? Sometimes you can overcome it before the meeting. You can have data that resolves that conflict. Sometimes you can bracket it, and you say, okay, we're not going to talk about this today. We're doing some school safety forums in a school district right after the Sandy Hook, the elementary school, that horrible tragedy. And a lot of what came out of that is people thought, all teachers should have guns, right? So the good guy can shoot the bad guy kind of thing, right? Well, in Colorado, there's a rule that no one can have a gun in the school except a police officer, right? So when we were having these discussions about how do we improve safety, I was able at the beginning of the meeting saying, we're not going to change state law today, right? So what we're talking about today is what this school district and this police department can do to increase safety in schools, right? So if you want to talk about, and part of the reason is gun control is a very polarized issue, it would take it in a completely different direction, right? So I was able to bracket that. That was an issue in the discourse that was really people people were struggling with making it hard for them to have a useful conversation, I was able at our meeting to bracket it and say, we're not going to talk about that, and this is why we're not going to talk about that. I did, once again, have a safety valve. One of the questions on the survey is, if you have suggestions for the state legislature in terms of changing gun control, what are they? Right? So they came to talk about that. You can still write it down. We're not saying you can't have that opinion, but we're saying at the table. Right? So these obstacles are trying to figure out, and this is probably not as relevant for a student activity, right? Because they're not going to engage the public, right? But if I'm going to engage the public, one thing I'm looking at is, I want to know before I walk in the room what are the biggest issues, right? So that's where a survey really helps me. I know they're going to be talking about this. Or the example I gave yesterday about the small schools and small class size, I knew walking in that there was that misconception, right? So then I can take care of it, right? Like we said, we had this presentation about that, so we overcome that obstacle. And you can think about the obstacle of making it hard. We can't have a real discussion because this stuff's distracting us. So how can I, as a practitioner, design the events so those aren't as distracting so we can get to the hard work of the deliberation? The next two I've been talking about all the last 2 days. So what are the key values? As I'm looking at this, what do people care about? What are the underlying values that are relevant to this issue? And then the tensions. What are the tensions between those values? So I don't think anyone's talking more about that. And then last, potential actions, particularly from a wide range of stakeholders, right? So as we now take on this issue, what are all the different players and what role might they play, right? Because again, deliberation is great when it's about a broad range of actions, right? So those are four, I call them buckets. As I'm analyzing issues, and I have worksheets, if you're interested, I can kind of send you to my students. So my students are doing 2 topics next week. This weekend they're filling out worksheets with these 4 buckets. As you analyze this issue, right, what are the values that you see with this issue? What are the tensions in here? What do you see as the key stakeholders and potential actions from those? So as they're walking in to relieve that conversation, they already have that in their head. And then, with the cycle of deliberation, the purpose of the conversation is to refine an understanding of those. Right? And to develop new actions, and particularly, it's like once we overcome the obstacles, so we can have a tough conversation. We recognize the common ground of the values. So we put our blinders down. We realize the people that we disagree with have some good stuff to do. Then now we recognize the inherent tension with the issue, so we struggle with that. And the way we struggle when we deal with that tension is we come up with some cool actions that work to balance or overcome those tensions. Right? And one quick thing to bounce back during break. Another way of thinking about the polarity management worksheet that kind of works with this, right? Typically, when we think about conflict, we think about tension between people or between perspectives, Democrats versus Republicans or whatever, right? But part of the wicked problem framework is that tensions are inherent to the issue, right? So if I'm a consistency person and you're a flexibility person, the tension at first needs to be between us, right? I think I'm right, you think you're right. But then once we complete that map, right, we recognize that I'm the consistency person, but I see the value of flexibility, right? So now I'm in tension within myself, right? So now the tension becomes within the issue, and that's part of the idea. So you came up during break and saying, I'm recognizing now that with some of these issues, I'm struggling with the tension. That's the point, right? And the point of a wicked problem is you're switching from wicked people to wicked problem, right? The wickedness is in the problem, and we're going to struggle with our own tensions in a sense, right? So when you're identifying those tensions, it's not just tensions between perspectives, it's tensions within the issue itself that we're going to constantly have to negotiate. So, sources for deliberative inquiry, traditional academic research, they're looking at actual real articles, but still you want that public stuff. So you want newspaper articles, advocacy websites. If you have time, you can do surveys and interviews and focus groups. This is one of the reasons I travel a lot to do training. I rarely travel to do projects, right? Because I think to do projects, I have to talk to so many different people. People think I can just walk in and run a meeting in some other community. I'm like, no, right? Unless you're doing lots of different surveys or something like that. Like I have a city just south of me that the city manager called me down and he wants me to run this event. And I'm like, okay, I need to go and talk to like 40 other people in your community. I can't trust you, right? Like I got your perspective now, right? So that's part of it is you need surveys to really see the different sides of things, so then you can really design something people will engage, right? But for a class, they can normally, for bigger issues, get enough from that, right? So then one of the activities, there's a lot of activities we can do, and I'm suggesting us to play with homelessness. Everyone know enough about the concept of homelessness is play with this, unless someone else has a different suggestion. And again, I did this on a bigger piece of paper, but we don't have to do it. But this is a little exercise that helps with 2 of the key products. It helps with identifying the key values, and it helps to identify the key players and stakeholders potentially. Right? And then inherently, by identifying the key values, it will help you identify the tensions between those values. Right? So what you're doing with this worksheet, and I'll send this electronically, so if you want to do it in class. So it kind of looks like this. This is a completed worksheet. We did this with a big group on the river, right? But first, what you want to do, we're going to have you brainstorm individually, maybe for 5 minutes, and then we're going to build one as a group, right? But first, you'll just list the stakeholder. What are the groups? When we talk about homelessness, right? Who's relevant to this? And where it gets difficult is how many different subgroups you want to do. Like, is be homeless themselves a stakeholder group, or do we kind of have categories of homeless, right? There's some that are temporarily homeless. There's some that are chronically homeless. There's some that are transient, that they're homeless and that kind of move around in the community. So you can kind of sometimes going to brainstorm homeless and then have some subgroups, right? But just think of it. If we're going to deal with homelessness in our community, who are all the relevant players? So I'll let you kind of brainstorm that in a second. Once you have a pretty decent list, you don't have to complete, you have a pretty decent list there, then you start kind of filling up the top, which is the interest. What do those groups care about? Right? What are the values, the underlying things that's kind of important to them in a sense, right? So you start, you start kind of putting some, and then you start bouncing back and forth because you'll write a value, and then you'll realize, oh, there's another group that really cares about that value, and you'll add to your stakeholder group, right? And vice versa. So you're kind of bouncing back and forth, and you're kind of getting a list of what are all the things people care about this issue, and who are all the groups. And if you want to, I tend not to do this next step, but you see on the bottom, if you want to, then you can actually complete it. You're going to look at, okay, for this group, which of these do they care about, right? You put a check mark if they really care about that value, right? But part of the process, so again, for the key products, you're getting a good list of stakeholders that have potential actions they can do. You're getting a list of values, and then you'll find out how some of these values don't fit together very well, right? That, gee, if we focus on this value, we're probably not focused on this value in a sense, right? So we'll see. Let me give you a couple minutes just to try to brain dump in terms of homelessness. See how many stakeholders you can get, see how many values, and then we'll talk it through as a group and see if we can kind of fill it out. The instructions making enough sense? Categories of homeless, or do you feel it's better just to kind of?
Oh no, there's homeless and then those who are not getting their mental health needs.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a typical class that if the cause of homelessness is mental health, right?
Yeah.
That's different than
Physically disabled. Orphan. The C class.
orphan or children, essentially.
Yeah,
right?
children are
I
those.
mean, we're finding, and I know a lot of my students are very passionate about GLBT issues, right? That there's a big homeless problem of the GLBT children that were kicked out of their homes,
Right.
That they were no longer welcome at home, which creates a distinct issue, right?
And there's criminal, and then those who are out of work.
Yeah, so I mean that's just one way to categorize them, and that's probably enough for us to kind of work with now, right? Out of work, but also probably able, right? They're able to work. They might have some skills in a sense, as they just don't have that ability right now, in a sense, right? And I'll put with the word transient is typically used, right? But for a lot of people, the image of homelessness is they're aggressive homeless, right? They might be panhandling pretty aggressively, those type of things. And with mental health too, we know a lot of mental health stuff can be tough, but often mental health and substance abuse kind of go together, right? Oftentimes, the reason they go together is because people don't get treatment for their mental health, so then they self-treat, right? But then sometimes that cause and effect can kind of go both ways in some senses, right? So that's the problem, because for some people see, oh, this is mental health, it's not their problem, it's a disease, we need to help them. Other people say, hey, this is a substance abuse, this is their choice, we don't need to help them, right? And that becomes that deserving and observing poor line, which really kind of changes how people think, right? Okay, beyond the homeless, what are some of the other groups?
Business owners? Business owners?
Business owner, yeah, especially like in a downtown area, right? Business owners that are losing customers because people are uncomfortable going downtown or those kind of things. That's a big issue in Fort Collins, especially during the summer, right? And same thing, we're a little too cold in the winter, right? But during the summer, we get a lot of people, especially, some people are saying, well, I don't know the truth about this, that since marijuana now is legal, right? So are people kind of coming to Colorado? The problem is you can't smoke it publicly, right? It's legal, you can buy it at a store now, but it's probably more expensive to buy it at the store than buying it illegally, right? And you still can't smoke it publicly. So the idea that people are coming to Colorado so they can smoke marijuana and be homeless, so like, well, technically it's illegal because you can only smoke it in a home and you're homeless. No, anyway. Not the homelessness money, but there. The business owners, what else?
Residents.
You know,
Yeah, residents kind of in that area, and even tourists in a sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And certainly kind of, in Fort Collins, we want to be a tourist destination, right? So that notion, if the homelessness issue becomes more and more of a problem, the Visitors Association is dealing with that, right? We need to bring those dollars in, right? And kind of same thing for downtown. You know, we're trying to redevelop, get downtown to be a destination at night. It's starting to get there, but it didn't used to be at all when I lived here, right? So to what degree is the homelessness
Thursday
issue?
night we couldn't find parking. Thursday night we couldn't find parking.
Right, yeah. What else?
So, so that,
Go ahead.
Local government. Local government.
Local government, okay. Yeah, so the kind of policies what policies do we have? To what degree do we criminalize homelessness, like you talked about, right?
social agency, the police,
well, yeah,
hospital, the
Yeah.
school.
Yeah, so social aid, we'll split those up. So you have police, hospital. Yeah, hospitals in particular because most homelessness put a lot of pressure on emergency rooms, right? And that's one of those arguments of the cost of, it's so much cheaper for a community just to give them a home because in terms of how many times they spend in jail, how much police time that they take, and how much emergency room resources they take, they get out. There's one example, it was like the $1 million neighborhood. It basically cost the community $1 million a year for one homeless person, right? Whereas they could have housed them for $40,000 or something like that, right?
Advocacy
And
groups.
they probably have you have government social programs, right? So like the county programs, and then you also have nonprofits.
And you can clear a little clarification. Government responsibilities, local, regional to national, charge of responsibility versus the social organizations who are motivated out of just quality of life issues.
Right. And you have it, one of the changes we deal with in Fort Collins is most of the programs, the social programs for poverty are county issues, right? Just with the funding, at least in the United States, between a city and a county, there are certain things that are city responsibility and certain things that are county responsibility. So like welfare programs are a county responsibility, right? But the homelessness is really only an issue in Fort Collins, right? So a lot of people are telling the city, you need to do something about this, but the city is saying, this is a county issue. It's about a social program, right? So there's that tension between city, county, state, and then federal in a way of whose jurisdiction is it, whose responsibility is it in a sense, and become part of it, right?
Did we include the church?
Sure, okay, yeah. So religious institutions? Which
And
often
Raquel
are very
said-
kind of,
Raquel said advocacy groups.
Yeah, I think that
You think
falls
that's
under
nonprofits?
nonprofits like storage, yeah.
and then on the flip side, some of them have mental health problems, you have mental health agencies, right? And the big part of the mental health programs is veterans,
Yes.
right? So then you have veterans hospital or veterans advocacy program. So we kind of stop there. We could keep going, right? But even just thinking about who are all the players in here, and this serves a few different purposes for me when I'm doing the community process. Because part of it is these people all need to be in the room if we're really having a conversation about how to deal with this, right? So we've actually done this. We did it particularly with early childhood education. We started a project. We did this brainstorming process, found out all the players. Then we said, okay, who knows somebody who can come to the meeting, right? And we did this on the board. Some people walked up and wrote down, yeah, I'll invite this person, I'll invite this person. And one of the things with convening is we kind of go with this assumption that if you invite everybody, you're really not inviting anybody, right? So that notion of just having a newspaper article and putting some posters up, you're not going to get an audience, right? That personal invitation, that email saying, you know what, Thomas, I need you there. Can you come here to represent your organization? Then people will come, right? So we did that process. We filled in most of the blanks because the people in the room were pretty connected. We had a few blanks empty, so then we kind of assigned them. Okay, Wendy, you need to figure out, you need to find someone from the faith community to come, right? And you need to figure out that kind of stuff. So then for when we actually had and that was even just for a planning meeting, right? For a planning meeting, we wanted a full room. And then for the meeting itself, we kind of did something similar, right? Mm-hmm. So the stakeholder analysis kind of works on that. But then the stakeholder analysis also works like once we get all those different groups, then we start thinking about, okay, what are the values? What are things people care about? these are tougher to frame, right? But I'm curious, what kind of things did y'all come up with for the top column or top row?
Humanity.
Humanity. Okay, yeah, so just kind of respect for human, kind of compassion, kind of in a way, right?
Well, I just wanted to comment because I think it's a little bit too broad. We should split mine into.
Okay, well, what do you got?
Well, I got health safety,
Good.
low crime rate.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll put kind of compassion.
I just wrote dignity and said that it's too wide.
I have to do this with smaller font here. Yeah, I mean, we certainly public safety, right? A lot of policies about the homeless are justified kind of for that. What else did you say?
Low crime rate.
Okay. So, and we do, what I try to do with this top one is we want to frame these positively, right? But we want, things that people care about in this sense, right? So I guess low crime rate will work, I think.
I don't think that people are
Yeah. Not quite fitting well here.
they can.
What else?
Services,
What do you mean by services?
what I mean is making sure that they eat, that this is having their basic needs.
Okay, so that kind of fits what she was saying about kind of compassion. For some reason, I have one S and two N's there. Compassion and kind of humanity, right? Kind of fits into that, right? To make sure people are kind of having their basic needs met,
Yeah,
right?
just like Maslow, the basic.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's like for the business owners, what are they caring about? Partly public safety, low crime,
Commerce.
commerce, yeah.
Cleanliness.
Aesthetics.
Okay. Yeah, no, part of it, I think aesthetics is
Yeah,
right.
aesthetics.
We want our downtown to look pretty, right? We want people to kind of
Yeah.
feel comfortable in it, right? We want tourists to kind of enjoy it in a sense.
So we, that cover city pride as
Yeah, city pride. Yeah, that's a nice way to think about it. Yeah, and that's really one of the things that Fort Collins calls itself a choice city, right? We're typically ranked in one of the best places to live. Right? There's a lot of pride in that, right? So the fact that our homeless population is growing, people are saying we're not a choice city if we have people that are suffering like this, right? Well, on both sides, right? Some people are kind of the compassion side, saying we can't brag about how good of our city is when we have people suffer like this, and then some people are saying we need to get rid of those people because it doesn't look good, right? So kind of on both sides in some way, right? What else?
Cost, oh, sorry.
Job opportunities for these homeless people.
Okay. So the potential for job opportunities and kind of self-sufficiency, right? So for some people the goal, for some people the goal is just temporarily kind of safety, and for some people is long-term work. I know a lot of stuff that we've been getting into when we get into actions. In a sense, we don't even really have. We didn't list a training programs, right? We didn't list a lot of the kind of solution to homelessness in some senses. In Fort Collins, our cost of living is just shooting up like crazy. Vacancy rates are very low. Very little affordable housing, right? So part of the homelessness thing is there's an imbalance between wages and cost of living in Fort Collins, right? In some ways that we're forcing kind of the people, the jobs are in Fort Collins, but there's no housing in Fort Collins. Right? So that job opportunities and wage fairness or equity, equality becomes kind of a, you're saying?
Cost of living, because it's shooting up in downtown Houston.
Yeah, so our goal, the interest is kind of a low cost of living, right?
And kind of the concept of someone being a productive citizen. This is that there's some quality of fairness and that the idea that what does it take to get someone to be productive? Is there assistance, justified, unjustified? It's
Yeah, so kind of justice and fairness, and part of it that comes up to too is the notion that I probably need to put up there for some people. Of the importance of individual responsibility, right? The importance of self-sufficiency, the importance of kind of the conservative side of it in a sense, right? That people need to make better choices in a way. Obviously in the United States, individual responsibility is kind of a powerful kind of assumption or value. So we can keep on going, kind of played out, but it's useful to do the stakeholder analysis to really think about who all the players are, because then that also not only kind of who you might want to have in the room, but if you're doing it for an assignment, who do you need to research, right? Who do I might need to talk to, right? It's interesting how often major groups are never talked to. I do a lot of stuff with K-12, obviously. how rarely school districts actually talk to students. So I had a student group I'm working with, and they wanted to do a project on bullying, right? So I started researching bullying, and then we contacted the district saying, hey, we want to do some forums on bullying. Would you help us kind of get some teachers that will give us a class period so we can do these forums? And then the school district said, oh, actually, we have a committee that's been studying bullying for 2 years. I'm like, oh, great. It's like, can you give me contact with them? So I got in contact with them, and I went to meet with them. So yeah, we're about to finish. We're writing a white paper. We're almost done. But we'll give it to you when you're done. So I said, who was on the committee? She said, oh, that was a great committee. We had some teachers, and we had some counselors, and we had lots of parents, and we had some psychologists. I'm like, did you have any students? She goes, oh, no. So, did you talk to any students in your process? Oh, no. 2 years studying bullying, they never actually talked to a child. Right? And it's because they didn't do the stakeholder, and they think children are transient. You're like, oh, they're gone by the time, but it's just amazing. Same thing when we did the school safety forums. And it was a different school district south of us. They wanted us to, so we did 3 nights of parents and all this kind of stuff. And I said, we need to talk to the kids. I said, oh, no, don't worry about that. I'm like, no, we need to talk. So then I pushed them enough that we had a night that we talked to 30 kids from all the different schools, heard completely different things than the parents, right? And the teachers, right? The teachers were saying, oh, we have all these new policies and the students believe in them, and the students were saying like, oh, we don't follow that. And we open all those doors all the time, So sometimes when you leave out a big stakeholder group, you're missing a huge perspective, right? So for a student group, you do this kind of thing. It's okay. Let's make sure we get these perspectives. Sometimes you can find them out through research. Sometimes you have to give a call. I know for me as an undergraduate student, the first time I ran into a professor that required me to actually talk to real people for research, to pick up the phone and talk to people, it completely changed my life. Right? I was just one of those, like, I'll find it on the internet somewhere or whatever, but actually calling real people and talking to them and asking them questions, it was like, wow, that was kind of cool. Right? So it's a pretty good assignment to have people do, like call a police officer and talk about their experience. I know when we did this meeting in homelessness a couple weeks ago, I wasn't very involved, I was just kind of observing, we weren't running it. But they had the park rangers. We have the parks and recreation, but a lot of camping, right? The homeless will camp in the parks and those type of things. So they were a critical voice in that conversation because they're the ones that are interacting with them a lot more, right? The police officers interacting with them downtown, but the park, I guess they're park rangers in a sense, they're the ones camping on the river and those type of things, right? So you start realizing some of those kind of new voices that you kind of need to hear. So with this, this helps us identify the values. It also starts not only the stakeholders, but then the actions. What are all the different things these groups can do, right? And then you also start, you talk a little bit about some of the tensions here, right? So the tensions in homelessness, that help versus hinder kind of tension, right? That we want them to be self-sufficient, we want them to be responsible, but we also want to help them out, right? Some people want to kind of blame them for the poverty, some people kind of blame the structure of society for the poverty. Well, there's a tension there, right? We want to have programs that help them, but we don't want those programs to be taken advantage of, right? There's a tension within the poverty research that, we all, the innocent child, the poor child is clearly a sympathetic figure, right? But then the parent that's making really bad choices, right, is unsympathetic. But how do we help the child without helping the So there's all these interesting tensions of what programs that we do. That churches do wonderful work, right? But then, we have a separation of church and state, right? And do we want, government programs that are funded through churches are very effective sometimes, but then they're through the church. And to what degree is part of the process of what the church is doing? Is it tied to religion that's inappropriate for the government to be funding? So as you start thinking through the roles of all of those, you start coming up with some interesting things there. And obviously the business owners want it clean. In some ways they want to criminalize homelessness, right, to get rid of homelessness. But it's not getting rid of it, right? It's just forcing it somewhere else. I know we've all seen those pictures of how in downtown areas where nooks and crannies where homeless tend to sleep, they're putting spikes now. Have you seen those examples? Right? They're actually installing spikes on the ground just so people wouldn't sleep there, right? Which your first image of that is horrible, right? Yeah. But the idea is not that they want to cause pain, right? That they're saying that's harming my business, and so they're coming from somewhere. But that's a good example of they're probably coming from a good place, right? It's easy to demonize them. They have a good, but when we actually weigh that, most people would say that's not a good idea, right? So if we can acknowledge that they're coming from a good place and we see what they're trying to do, but in balance, we still think you're wrong, right?
Well, it's not even a good place, but they basically struck along a solution that didn't really kind of serve only one master, which is their own interest without the other.
Yeah.
Because they're in
Yeah,
context.
and actual, so we have a park just north of our downtown area that tends to be a major hangout for homeless. So one of the plans right now is to pave over the park and make it a parking lot. Right? And I guess some people magically think, well, because then the homeless will disappear. I'm like, no, they'll probably find somewhere else, right? So, and there's that tension of always kind of short-term kind of dealing with symptoms versus long-term true solutions in a way. Right? Oh, and actually, one of the biggest tensions with homelessness is if your city becomes known as having really good policies to help the homeless, to what degree do you become a magnet for homelessness? Now, research shows that tends not to happen nearly as much as you think. Right? In Fort Collins, it's happened somewhat. I mean, they do these. They call them point-in-time studies. That they actually try to do a survey of all homeless, and they have volunteers go out there and ask. One of the questions they're asking are you from this community, or did you come here? How long ago did you come here? Our percentage of people coming to Fort Collins is pretty high, right? Normally, most of your homeless is homegrown homeless, right? And part of the reason is because when you're in poverty, relationships are huge, right? So for you to leave your community to go to another community because you perceive that other community to have better resources for you is a hard move, right? Because you're leaving your whole social network, right? So that's where it doesn't happen nearly as much, right? But there is that assumption. And what happens in Fort Collins is we get them from all the small towns, right? We'll come to Fort Collins because there's going to be resources and there's going to be other kind of thing, right? But there is that perception that, hey, if we have a very generous community to help homeless, does that attract homelessness? Which is kind of a tough issue to kind of think about it. Right? So you start kind of seeing some of those tensions as you kind of
So where would you insert what's happening on national policies versus practices? Because
like national policies in terms of laws.
well, the housing first, like the whole idea about that community, just in a particular drill down on that one about that idea. Again, as if you were facilitating or sorting this out at this beginning, because there is a national program that housing first model, permanent supportive housing, is actually going to kind of level the playing field, so you won't have that charge about a community because it will be because that's a national. Anyone who's participating is getting money to target the homeless. Homeless veterans was a national campaign. They actually had a drop in homelessness across the nation because they targeted the homeless veterans.
Yeah, so I mean, we briefly talked about it. We didn't put it out there, but national, state, and county governments, so what kind of national programs are coming up? And then I also, from that, talked about the housing authority, right? So we have a Fort Collins Housing Authority, which is a kind of pseudo-governmental kind of organization that's really focused on affordable housing. So we're actually just building kind of a new supportive housing kind of program. It's going to house about 40 people. It's going to be open in about a month. That was an interesting controversy, where to place that, kind of the not in my backyard kind of thing, right? But then you also have the Board of Realtors. The Board of Realtors is actually a pretty big player in Fort Collins. Interestingly, for really kind of focused on developing more affordable housing and kind of sounding the alarm of how little affordable housing that we have in some senses. Right. So again, you see additional players that are kind of voice of it. The notion of what national programs. So we did a big healthcare thing probably our second year. And this was before Obamacare, and I think Obamacare has become just the word for it. It's not really any more than tap for it, right? So hopefully you're not thinking if I'm saying Obamacare, I'm attacking it. It's just the easier way to kind of refer to it. But so before that, states were kind of given some leeway to kind of come up with their own kind of healthcare changes, right? So our state came up with they did a call for proposals for any organization can come up with a new healthcare plan. And then they had a blue ribbon commission to look at it, and they came up with 5 that they really liked. So then we ran an event with League of Women Voters to really kind of walk through those 5, right? But constantly with the healthcare, and this happens with poverty a lot, there was that assumption that if Fort Collins or Colorado or Fort Collins, that this is a national issue. This is a fundamental flaw of society. And so if we do cool things in Fort Collins to deal with poverty, we're actually being counterproductive. Because what we need is a national change, right? And if we make things work, if we make a bad system work okay, it's going to be harder to make the argument to change the bigger system, right? So that becomes a tension in kind of in itself. That's kind of the same thing for homelessness. It's like, instead of us as a city figuring out how do we deal with our homeless problem, you know what, we need to, I remember at one conference dealing with poverty, the speaker before me was an anthropology professor who was a Marxist and anti-capitalist, right? So he gave like an hour-long lecture about how we just need to overthrow capitalism. And then it was my turn to talk. And I'm like, it's like, I'm not sure how to follow that, right? It's like, okay, so while we're working on overthrowing capitalism, like, I am kind of working on trying to make capitalism work as well as it can, So yeah, there's always that tension in the sense of what's the scope of the project, right? Are you talking local? Are you talking county? Are you talking region? Are you talking state? Are you talking nation? Are you talking global, right? And you have to put some kind of boundaries on that conversation. But what those boundaries are always going to kind of be tough. We struggle a lot with city versus county, right? Because the United Way that I work with a lot is United Way of Larimer County, right? So Fort Collins is a big city, Loveland is kind of a medium city, Estes Park is a smaller city, and then there's about another 10 tiny communities, and then there's a lot of rural community, right? So when we're talking about an issue, we get in trouble a lot if it's too Fort Collins centric. Right? That if we even have a meeting in Fort Collins, right? So we often have to have meetings in Loveland and Estes Park just to spread it around. And it'd be a lot easier for me to say, hey, we're talking about Fort Collins, right? But some of my partners are very county focused, or they're so that scope always becomes a kind of a tough challenge in a way. In some different ways. Okay, I need to move on, but hopefully you see kind of this tool. I need some back to the PowerPoint. Get onto framing. 215. There are steps here. Yeah, if you need to go to that, I don't think we're going to have another break before we leave, so if you need to go to that, go ahead. That's just thinking notes. All right, so now we've identified the issue, we've kind of talked about homelessness, we've identified some of the underlying values and the key kind of players and those type of things. So then you want to name the issue. You want to come up with a name. And this is the idea of what's going to be on your flyer, what's going to be on the front of your booklet, right? You see lots of examples. That's not my stuff. Yeah, here we go. What's going to, here is too many children left behind. How can we close the achievement gap? Protecting our right. What goes on the internet? What is the 21st century mission of our school? What's the label on the top, right? And you're framing it, you're hopefully framing it to have a pretty broad intent, to bring people from different perspectives that are going to want that, right? So you want a broad frame that includes a lot of the key stakeholders' concerns, right? And so when we're doing homelessness, are we framing it just on the kind of compassion frame? Is it just about what can we do to help these poor people? Or are we including the businessmen, right? Are we including the police and saying, this is also about public safety. It's also about the beautification of the downtown, right? So how do we both kind of care about compassion, but also kind of care about the quality, that kind of stuff, right? And you're making some choices there. If you're making a choice that, I don't care about the business person's perspective. We're just going to focus. That might still be a useful tool to kind of rally the true believers in the choir, but you're not changing the conversation, right? If the business person who's dealing with homelessness every day looks at your topic and says, I don't see me in here, right? They don't care about my opinion, right? Then you're not going to transform the conversation in a way, right? So that becomes a question of who is your audience in a sense. We struggle with that, particularly with climate change. Okay, if we're going to deal with climate change, are we open to the deniers? Are we going to say to people that think climate change is a complete hoax? Are they part of the conversation or not? And that's a tough decision because in some senses, yeah, we need to take them on and they need to be part of the solution. But in some senses, if we do take them on, then we're going to be spinning our wheels for a while. Do we just say, hey, we're going to work with the 80% of the people that already kind of assume it's happening and want to figure out what to do? There's not a right answer to that, but that your naming process is always going to be that of how many of those different values are incorporating that, right? To what degree are you taking the different perspectives on? And it's very hard to say, we're going to take all perspectives, right? Again, for immigration, I'm not going to include the white supremacists, right? I don't feel that they should see themselves and feel comfortable coming. I'm perfectly fine if they stay home, right? But I do want to have certain conservative and progressive perspectives in a sense. Right? I want some people to think that color doesn't matter whatsoever, and some people that say, no, we need to celebrate different, well, lots of different kind of perspectives. So avoid inflammatory terms, right? And carefully think about word choice and imagery. The example one of my friends always gives is NIF developed an issue book on alcohol. I don't think you have it here. But the image was like a broken, it was a very negative image on the cover, right? Or they did another one about schools, and they ended up like, how do we fix our broken schools, right? But it implied from the very beginning that the schools were broke, So a teacher looking at that, are they going to show that mean? Right? They say, well, you're telling us it's completely broken. So what words are you using? How are you framing it? So it's really kind of welcoming in some ways. Overall, typically focus on a common problem. That's why I tend to rely on the phrase of what should we do about X, right? So it's just kind of open in a sense, and just frame X in a way that most people agree X is something we need to do something about. Right? So what should we do about X? How can we achieve X? How can we optimize safety in our schools and things like that? So here's some examples. These are NIF. Here we go. Alcohol, controlling the toxic spill. You can't see the whole thing, but the bottom of that is like a skull and cross. It's like this alcohol so horrible, right? So someone who enjoys alcohol or that kind of stuff, that doesn't abuse it in a sense, like this is not a place for me. They're going to be demonized alcohol, right? So that's one that NIF framed that I think they really realized that they framed it wrong, right? Coping for the cost, and you can also control the scope. Healthcare is such a huge issue, right? So with this issue, they try to narrow it. Let's talk a little bit about cost, right? Instead of fixing the healthcare system, how do we figure out how we can deal with healthcare costs, right? So there's ways sometimes with the naming of it that you kind of limit. So these are some specific ones that we've done, and again, you see I like the questions. How should we improve? What should we do about? How should we meet our future water needs? I tend to like to ask questions at the top label. So once you have a name, now you develop potential approaches, and we'll try to kind of play with this a little bit with homelessness or maybe another issue. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your idea, and we can kind of brainstorm that a little bit too.
Well, mine is so different.
Okay.
It really, it's taking this, but using it in literature, for a literature class.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't, you don't go through this whole process, right? Because it's more academic.
But I think in terms of here, you can almost pick up, right? Maybe if there's a situation, if there's a tension within the story of the literature that you're wanting students to really think through, right?
Yeah, I did come up with 3 approaches to a short story. So,
But let me talk about this a little bit, and then we'll jump back to it, right? So the NIF model, it's at least 3. I know when I did water, I did 4. Other things I've done 5. Another, I think I gave you the link to this in the back, but Everyday Democracy used to be called study circles, if everyone heard the term study circles, but they were people that used to work for NIF and then started another company. Partly is that they saw that NIF was too short, just 2 hours wasn't enough. So the study circles program is essentially the same model. Here's the common ground, here's lots of idea, and let's think through it. It has more of a connection to action. But it's like a meeting, 2-hour meeting every week for 6 weeks, right? And they have booklets. They have one on diversity, they have one on immigration, they have one on kind of community sprawl and those type of things.
Totally works for action.
Yeah, really useful kind of things that say but all have like here's like multiple. Sometimes they have like 14 different viewpoints, right? Here's 14 different viewpoints on this issue that people talk through, right? So other examples you can find online, right? So develop potential approaches. But the idea, again, of the approaches is to think broadly about the issue, to see different sides, to get away from a typical pro-con, at least in the United States, to get away from a typical Democrat versus Republican kind of framing, right? And also have something for people to react to. So when they're coming to this meeting, I'm not having to react to your ideas, we're all reacting to these ideas. It gives us like a surrogate, in a sense, that makes it a lot easier for us to talk through some of the tough issues, right? So this is, the approach, each approach has some specific actions like we've been looking at with both the one on higher ed and one on obesity. And then, so each one inherently has things that people like and don't like about it. And here are all the underlying values, right? And some values support some of the approaches and some of them support others. But every single one of the approaches has key values that support it. And every single one of the approaches has some trade-offs. Because again, there's not a magic bullet, right? So you have this page actually from the packet from my workbook. Right? It's page, probably like the 4th or 5th page that you have. Right after the 5th page, before the 5th page. Yeah, it's page 47. So what we do in my class is, again, they pick a debate issue, they're debating a yes-no issue, and then they have to transition their debate to a deliberation. So they're going from two sides, yes, no, and they have to go to at least three. This is one of the handouts that I showed. Like, this is one way to think about it, right? Dividing up those approaches. You can divide it up as, what are the different primary actors? That's what we did with the obesity framing, right? The obesity framing is families need to solve this problem, schools need to solve this problem, no government has to solve this problem, right? So that's one way to split it up for the conversation. You could just have basic different policy ideas. So I know the energy one, I think I gave you that example on the next page. It kind of has, well, what we need to do is kind of focus on security and kind of, drill, like, develop domestic resources so we don't have to rely on other countries. Right? The second one is we need to develop renewable energy here in the United States and really kind of push for wind and solar and those type of things. And the third is we really need to reduce our energy use. Right? We need to be much more efficient with our So each kind of approach is a different idea. Right? What you want to do with these approaches is you don't want one approach to be the opposite of another. Right? You don't want one approach to be, drill more here, and the second one say drill less here, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're talking about drill more here, you're inherently talking about we should do this or why we shouldn't do it, right? So if your second approach is the opposite of the first approach, by the time you get there, you've already talked about it. Because all the criticism of the first approach is the advantage of the first thing, So in a way, you're doing 6 approaches. You have 3 approaches, but you're arguing for and against it within each conversation, right? So that's why you don't want, any approach to be the mirror image of another. Different views of the source, the cause of the problem, right? So you kind of think through, okay, let's assume first that the cause for homelessness, maybe we can make this work with that, right? The cause is individual are making bad choices. The cause is low wages is kind of the cause, or the cause is lack of resources for mental health, right? So then maybe that's the frame to kind of start each to really think, okay, if we assume that's the cause, then what do we need to do? So that's one way to split it up. Different degrees of response. We did this for the medical marijuana before we passed all marijuana. We were struggling in Colorado to allow medical marijuana. So we came up with an approach. We actually ran this in the city. Got some awards for the city. But the first approach was we just need to really regulate marijuana, close it all down, and allow it at all. The second approach was like free market. Let them do whatever. Let's open it up. And the third approach is let's make sure the people that need it for health reasons, legitimate health reasons, get it, but no one else does. Right? But of course, legitimate health reasons is a hard line to draw. Right? So that conversation, that's kind of a default that the other ones don't work. Because that was pretty obvious that the first 2 are bad and the third one is better, right? But it's also the recognition that drawing those lines are tough, right? But it's still, by spending dedicated time, what happens if we regulate this like crazy? What happens if we barely regulate it at all? And what happens if we try to kind of draw those lines as a society? This last one's interesting. This is really useful for any kind of bad behavior. We want people to eat better, or we want people to stop smoking, or stop doing drugs, or stop driving drunk, or whatever. So the Forest Service came up with these, the 3 E's: education, engineering, or enforcement. Right? So education is, let's just teach people to make better decisions. Right? So we're not going to punish them for making a bad decision. We just want to teach them to make a better decision. Engineering is, how do we design society so they don't make those decisions? Right? The example for a while, remember, I don't know if y'all heard, yeah, y'all are all as old as me, I think, when it didn't work when I did it with my college students. That's why I stopped for a second. Where seatbelts used to be automatic, like for a few years. Like you would get into your Honda Civic and close the door and the seatbelt, and it automatically closed, right? That was engineering, right? Instead of trying to teach people to wear your seatbelts, we're just going to design cars that your seatbelts are automatic, right? Instead of teaching people to turn off lights, what do we have now? Right? We have motion detectors, right? In my office, I always walk in, I hang my coat. My coat's right by the motion detector. So like 5 minutes into my office, my lights turn off, and I have to go like this, trying to get past the code, like I'm still here, But instead of teaching people to turn off lights, we do everything automatic now, right? In Colorado, we have lots of bears when you go camping, right? So now all the trash cans are these super heavy trash cans. You have to do all these levers because they close automatically, right? So there's a lot of engineering things that you can do. DWI, right? So we just had a horrible accident in Fort Collins where someone had 15 DWIs just killed a family, right? So we're saying, okay, what do we do? So there's some cars that you have to blow into the car before you can start, right? You've had so many DWIs that you're going to have, an alcohol test before you start the car every single time. Right? So there's ways of how do we kind of engineer society so we don't have to make those good choices. And then last, enforcement is how do we use government or incentives just to kind of force those good choices, to punish the bad choices, or to incentivize with taxes, or so you got to think of childhood obesity, right? Are we teaching people nutrition? Are we engineering things so they don't have any choices? We're you see some examples of this, of infusing junk food with vitamins and minerals, that kind of stuff. Or are you kind of regulating junk food? And then different ideal futures, there is kind of, so we did one for the city of Longmont where they did a process of imagining futures. What kind of Longmont do you want, right? So it's more of here's 3 different futures, and then the actions were different paths to those futures. So we talked about each one at a time. So those are just some of the ways of thinking about once you have your issue, kind of how do we want to frame it? How do we kind of create these kind of 3? You do want them, here's just a few more examples. Well, let me jump past these for a second and kind of get to some of the more, and we'll try to kind of frame it. So some key issues to think about, I probably touched on these a few already. Avoid directly opposing approaches, I already talked about that already. Usually avoid status quo as an option. We tend not to say one approach is, let's just keep it the way it is, right? Because normally you want to pick an issue that people agree status quo is not working. We got to do something about this, right? So you don't want status quo to be an option. But there has been some situations that have made sense. Popular framing versus reframing. This is one of the, I think sometimes NIF tries too hard to change the conversation, right? So in some ways you want to reframe it, you want to kind of change it, you don't want to have the same typical conversation, but then if you change it too much, it's too foreign to people, and they don't engage it very. It's like the healthcare book, I don't know if you, that last healthcare book was, it was hard for people to engage in, and I think they focused too much on changing the conversation. So there's a delicate balance there that you have to play, that you want to kind of get it away from the typical things that everyone talks about that we get stuck on, but not too far away that they struggle engaging.
We've got another one this year.
Huh?
Their issue this year is healthcare.
No, is it? How to deal with popular opinions that aren't realistic or supported by data. This is, so with the water thing, in Fort Collins we have, I already talked about water, that we growing population, we don't have enough water, how do we deal with that, right? So for some people, the way they want to deal with it is, don't let anybody else in. We just, no more growth, right? The problem is in our society, you can't do that, right? We can't just close it down. We can't tell people not to move there anymore, right? We can basically let the cost of living get so high that people don't move here, but that also means service industry people can't live here, and the society doesn't function in a way. But if we had this conversation about water and we didn't talk about growth, we would have people there saying, we're not talking about growth, right? So I ended up putting an approach on that our goal was to slow down growth and stop growing as a community in a way. And I think countering people would disagree with me on here. They always feel every approach has to be kind of viable and kind of equal and those type of things. But for me and my community to spark that conversation, I knew we needed to talk about growth. But I knew, or I was very confident, I guess I can say I was new. I was pretty confident that if we had that conversation, people would realize that approach wouldn't work, right? So I purposely put it first. I framed it well. I didn't try to frame it I didn't design it to fail, right? But it was that recognition. It was, in a way, it was an obstacle, right? It was an obstacle that people were thinking that was the magic bullet, right? But most experts that I talked to, realized that there's no way you could stop growth. Right? You don't have that much control in a sense, in a way, right? So by putting it as a first approach, people got a top chance to talk about it. By the end of talking about it for 15 minutes, realized that that's not really a viable approach. Then they took the rest of them more seriously. Right? Same thing when we used to do the energy problem book. My students are mainly progressive, in Colorado, right? Especially with energy issues and environmental issues. The first approach in the NIF book was the conservative approach that we needed to drill locally, and they would just dump on it. Blah, 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 blah. And partly because renewable energy is a magic bullet for them. They think we should just switch over to wind power, right? But then when they actually have the real conversation about renewable energy, they realize it's a lot harder than we think, right? The percentage of our power that's coming from renewable is pretty low, So then we ended up flipping it. We would do the second and the third, and we would end with the first approach. And once they would do the second and third approach and realize that those weren't as easy as they thought, they would take the first approach a lot more seriously. So the order of the approaches become pretty important. I've struggled with the childhood obesity one, that I never know if I should do the family approach first or last, right? Because in some ways, I want people to probably realize that we can't have families. Families can't take all the responsibility. It's beyond them. So then hopefully they take the last two seriously. Right? They're saying, okay, we've established that we can't just expect families to start being much better families and much better parents. So then, do we rely on schools? But there is a purpose and a way of how you organize them. Though I will say, some people would disagree with me on that. They know each one has to stand alone. The order shouldn't matter. I'm like, no, sometimes you have to kind of frame them in a certain way so you help that conversation in a sense. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree.
The length level of detail, so sometimes for the water stuff, we had 1 page, 11 by 17 page, which was a placemat that they react to. Right? The old NIF books were about 30 pages long. Right? The newer books were about 12 pages long. Right? A lot of times I do one that's 4 pages. That's a front page, and then each page is a different approach. Right? So there's lots of ways of doing it. My students' assignment in class, it normally ends out being about 18 pages. It's like each approach is 2 or 3 pages, but I tell them you'll have lots of charts and graphs in there, so it's not 18 pages of text. It might be really only 14 pages, and then I want a few pictures and I want a few graphs and those type of things. But that length of the book, the reality is, if you're running it for a public event, they're not going to read a 30-page book. So I try to make it that it's something they can react to on the fly, right? But then you also don't want to simplify issues that much, right? So you're kind of having that balance. The really nice thing about the old NIF books, or even the 12-pagers, is you can assign them to students, and then they get a lot more detail to prep for it. Right? So my student facilitators will read the full book, but then we run in the community. So all the old books for NIF, so it's a 30-page book, but again, then the last 2 pages is a summary. Comparing approaches, it has 1 column for each. So we photocopy this. This is what people have in front of them to talk about it. Right? But my facilitators can read the whole book. So they know a little bit more detail, right? So then they feel that they're a little bit more of an expert that they can run the thing. So do this as a class assignment that, you bring these books, the students pick the book, they have to at home read it, and then they run the discussion in their community and their class, just using this for everybody else. So it's a nice little class assignment. Yeah, the order of the approach that I was just talking about, sometimes that matters, right? So especially if there's a public assumption that's really popular, but it's not supported by data, there's this gap between the public and experts. Sometimes you can talk it away. Sometimes you say, we're not going to talk about growth because, right? But I just knew with that group that they were going to cause a problem. And I thought, we need to talk about that, even though I'm pretty sure that if we were to talk about that, and they actually came and thanked me. I had people from that area that are always the ones talking about city council about growth said, I appreciate that you actually had our voice in there. So I think it worked in some way. And then minimize making the document the focus. This is what I talked about a little bit earlier, in the sense I always tell people it's an in-process document, right? And I want them to react to it. The goal of the process is always to improve the document, right? So I want them to scratch it and write on it, but also at the same time not make it the focus. Okay, work with it now. Try to make the best of the document. If you see flaws, if you see missing, let us know. But try to use it for what we're trying to use it for. Just like this conversation. So these are just some more examples pulled from NIF. They're all available online. But I don't know if we want to. We have about 20 minutes or so here. Maybe talk a little about your idea now in terms of how you're thinking about the approaches for literature.
Okay, well, I'm part of the teaching circle, which is what we're doing this semester, is trying to use deliberation in the classroom, right? But the challenge is that my class is a literature class. So I took a story that we're going to read called Sin of Omission. And what I did was to see if I want to use this approach, the deliberation approach, to see if students will do better in discussion of the issues in the story. So just, I think the approach is kind of summarize the story, but basically it's a story that is set in a town. So then what I was going to do is tell the students, you're part of the town, you're part of that community, you're pretending that you're part of that community, so I guess it would be role-playing, right? And then, since the title of the story is Sin of Omission, I was going to focus on who committed the sin. Okay, because the story is open-ended enough that it could be a variety of players in the story, right, that committed the sin. Which was the sin?
So it's not technically a factual question. There's not someone who committed the sin. It's an open question. If you don't write it down.
Is there a right answer?
Well, here, I don't know. It might help to read it.
It's a very short story.
It's 3 pages.
Oh.
So what happens in approach one is where there's there's Lope, who is one of the main characters who grows up in the story. There's Emeterio, who is his uncle, and then there is the daughter, and that's basically it. So for approach one, you could say Lope has committed the sin. We could say that, right? Because he kills Emeterio in cold blood. Okay, he just lifts up a rock and he throws it on top of his head and kills him. And Emeterio doesn't know what's coming, so he doesn't even make any kind of reaction to being killed. Emeterio took him in when he had no one else and gave him a job and food and shelter. So Lope owes his life to Emeterio. Okay, so technically Lope has committed the sin of murder. Right? However, the second approach, you could also say that Emeterio has committed the sin because he took Lope in, but instead of giving him an education and treating him as a member of his family, which he is because Emeterio is Lope's uncle, he sent Lope to work for him as a shepherd on the mountain, where he only had Roque for company, who was a man who couldn't speak. He was much older than Lope. He was like 50 years old. And the shepherds never came down from the mountain. So in 5 years, Lope never came back to the town until he was asked to come in to see a doctor, just to certify that he was still alive. So where they only gave him bacon, grease, and bread to eat, wine or water to drink. So Emeterio was actually the mayor of the town. He was rich. He only had one daughter, so he could have given Lope, a university education. He could have made him treated him like the nephew, like a son, right? And instead he got treated like a servant. Or you could say in approach 3 that society has committed the sin because someone from the town should have made Emeterio send Lope to school. The school teacher tells Emeterio, he's a bright boy, you should send him to school. And Emeterio's like, no, he has to earn a living. He has to go learn how to be a shepherd because he has to, put food on the table, earn his living, right? So he was only 13 years old, though, when Emeterio put him to work. So you could also say it's kind of like child abuse to go make him work on the mountain. So it is society's responsibility to make sure that all children go to school and are well fed. Okay, so that's what makes the story hard. Is yes, Lope committed the murder, right? So you could say that's his sin. That's the sin. But then the sin is sin of omission. So
I think it has a wicked problems angle to it, right? That there's not.
it has a
there isn't
wicked
a right
problem.
answer.
Thank you. I was like, literature has wicked problem.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
So,
I think
and-
that would spark a really interesting discussion.
It
And kind of the
really
same
is
thing of
interesting.
spending some time. Let's spend time on approach 1. Assuming that's the perspective. How do you respond to that?
Mhm.
I think that would be interesting.
See, and I'm hoping that they also realize, I think that we are testing our students so much. They get tested in elementary school and high school and then college, and then their teachers in college were teaching to another test. So they're just teaching them little pieces of information that when they get to a class like literature, they think there's one answer. And they're looking for that little piece of answer. And I'm just like, there is none. There are better interpretations and there are worse interpretations. And yes, I can say it's wrong if you tell me this is about space aliens, right? I'm like, yeah, no. But within that, though, you can say a lot of interpretations. And hopefully, if you see 3 different approaches, you can see how you can see it differently. Right? And it will make them think that, okay, so there's no right answer. They're just different answers.
And could you,
It's about judgment, right?
Yeah, it's about
wisdom.
judgment, yeah.
and then would you frame that as and again, I'm not an expert on literature, but does that fall under like a tragedy, or is this
Well, it is a tragedy
Okay.
on various levels, right? I mean, he kills Emeterio, so that's a tragedy. He is lacking in human contact. Lope is lacking, right? Because
Right.
his uncle wouldn't give him that. An education, his uncle refused to give him that. So that's another tragedy. And at the end of the story, the people from the town are murmuring, and they are against. It ends like this: all the old women in the town are saying, "Oh, how dare he kill his uncle? Oh my gosh, he who took him in, and he gave him food, and he made him a man." And then Lope is just, going towards the prison, saying, "Yes, yes, yes, yes." And we don't know what that yes means. We don't know what yes. So we don't know what the yes means. Is he admitting guilt? I mean, he's admitting his guilt. Everybody's going to kill him. But is he also saying, or is there something else in there? So
It's about the definition of sin, or it's like a Stassis model in a sense, right?
Yeah.
The Stassis model is a stock issue model with an argumentation and a legal term, right? I mean, so what we know is he killed him, right?
Mhm.
What we don't know was it murder,
Yes.
right? Was it justified? Was it, all this kind of stuff? So that those become more open questions to interpretation and discussion in a sense. So we have about 15 minutes, and then we do have to end on time.
Yeah, we have
I
a
choose the
plane
airport.
to catch.
Let me jump ahead really briefly, and then we can go back and kind of talk more about the approaches, but just to kind of make sure I get to this. So the last part, once you, the developing potential approaches is kind of really the hardest step and kind of the key step, right? Because once you have that, everything else is kind of fill in the blank in some way, right? So I can send these to you. I don't know if I gave them to you in your PowerPoint, right? So with my students, I have two different worksheets that they do. This is like an internal worksheet. This is an approach development worksheet. It's very similar to one of the ones that's in the packet that I gave you that we had, the elements of choices, this example for the healthcare, right? So this is more of an internal thing for students to kind of work through the issue. And then the placemat, which the assignment, when they're writing out, so there's a public version that other people will use to make sense of it. This is kind of the internal version for the person developing to make sense of it, right? So you see this one has categories for, so once you have the three approaches, you would write them up there. And okay, so from that approach, how do they define the problem, right? What's the broad remedy? What are they saying needs to change, right? What are some specific policy options? What are some specific actions from a broad range of stakeholders, right? So who's doing what, in a sense? What are some facts that support the approach? So where's some actual really hard data, in a sense, that would support this? What are the key values? So for that approach, what are the values that are kind of on the top of the hierarchy? And then what are the cons? What are the kind of pushback and the trade-offs, right? So they kind of work on that to kind of, and sometimes as you start putting on the details, you have to make changes to the approaches, right? Maybe two of the approaches was really easy to do that. The third approach, you're really struggling. So then you might need to kind of back up and kind of play with the approaches again to make sure that they're kind of divided up equally, right? Then this becomes the placemat, which is the public thing, right? And you could do an assignment that all they have to do is come up with a placemat. I literally, for the water stuff, I went into a water conflict class, it's a graduate class, once a week for an hour, right? So they did a lot of conflict with the water law, and I came in for an hour, it's kind of what I did today, to train them about framing. And then the next week they had to bring a placemat for water in northern Colorado, right? So we got 20 of those from the community, from this class. And then me and the person that taught the class went through all the 20. We picked the one that we liked the most, and then we incorporated some aspects of the other one, and that was the first draft or one for the community. And then we sent it to the advocacy group for the river, and we sent it to the power company, and then they kind of made some suggestions, refine it, but then that's what we did for the public. So this is an assignment that in an hour you kind of explain it and then say, hey, you go home and complete one of these, right, for an issue that you've been studying already in some sense, right? So then this becomes a placemat. I do this on a legal site piece of paper, so they have a little bit of room here to explain the problem, explain, what should we do about X? So first you have to establish X is a problem we should all care about, childhood obesity or whatever. Then you have the three approaches. So you have the title of the approach, a brief explanation, so normally like 2 or 3 sentences here that say what that approach is, then what should be done, so a bullet list of some specific actions, the key advantages, the arguments for this position, and then the trade-offs on the bottom. And then the book itself just becomes this thing, but each bullet point, instead of a bullet point, it's a paragraph, right? And it's saying we should do this, we should tax junk food, right? And then you have a little paragraph, and the degree to which you want to make it a bigger assignment, they have to have sources and have to cite their sources and footnotes and all that kind of stuff depends on how much time you want to spend on it, right? So part of it could be just a brainstorming process to kind of come up with an issue they already understand, or it could be very much a research project that they have to. In my class is a semester project, so they have to have 20 different sources. They have to have government sources and academic sources, and public, and all that kind of stuff. So the comment form, you might just have that one-page placemat. The 4-pager is you have 1 page for approach, so you have an introduction and 4-page for. A lot of times we'll do the 11 by 17, so it folds, right? So they have a title page, and then you open up, and then you might have the 3 approaches across these pages, and then on the back you have some kind of discussion questions or reflection questions, right? So that's kind of one easy way for the students to kind of work it. But that's if they have access to 11 by 17 paper or something. So, the 8-pager is you have the intro, and then once you open it up, you have 2 pages per approach, right? And a lot of times when we do this in the public, we want this to be a workbook for them. right? So you might have some data about some open space for people to kind of write comments and those type of things. But the idea of the placemat is they have it in front of them, they see everything. So while we're doing approach 1, they see all the items of approach 1, right? And they can turn the page or approach 3, and, or the full book with a summary at the end, right? So I gave you these links if you want to go to them, but these are 3 organizations that basically use the NIF model. Here's a common problem. Public Agenda calls them discussion starters, right? Everyday Democracy actually has an issue guide exchange, a place where people that have developed these can kind of send theirs in and share and things like that. By the way, some of the NIF ones you have to pay for. I have PDFs of almost all of them, right? So if you see something online that looks interesting, Wendy does this all the time, right? Hey, do you have the alcohol one? And I'll send you the PDF back, right? So if you have an issue you're interested in, feel free to email me, and if I know there's an issue book somewhere, I'll get it to you. There's also, I did put the link here, if you Google reframing framing, Public Agenda has a nice little article for students. It's probably like 10, 12 pages long. And it talks about the need to frame for deliberation versus framing for strategy as you go. Right? So that's it. So let me bounce back now to let's try here in the last 10 minutes. If we were to try to come up with a framing on homelessness, right? We'll name it the easy way. What should we do about homelessness in downtown Houston? Right? What are some possible approaches? And one thing, not always, this one doesn't actually have it. I tend to like the approaches to be action statements. Right? Notice for a lot of these, the first word is a verb. Create and implement, right? This one, not quite. Improve, right? Make it easier. Stop the bleeding. Break the cycle, right? So a lot of times it seems like each one kind of being a broad action step, right? But not always, right? The ones, this one in particular is more taking that framing of each approach is a different key actor in a way. But I don't know if anyone's kind of thinking through, if you're to say, here's 3 broad approaches to take on homelessness. What might one be?
Well, one that I was, as you were describing things, the significance of ultimately creating a possibility for everyone to be productive. One conversation I had about disability, and the reality is just enough support to be able to. Just enough, so it's not so much framing someone as having disability, but they need support to be able to take care of themselves, or to be able to be more productive and hold down that job, and hold down their health care costs by having a way of managing it better. And the extreme is letting things as they are, and the other extreme is managed care, and just completely treat it as a social health problem versus a personal responsibility.
So an approach might be something like strive to help everyone to become a productive member of society, or something like that. In a way.
Yeah, well, when's a second chance, or what is a reasonable thing if someone's been proven they've never gotten sufficient health care, or they're mental and having a hard time keeping on their meds, and their families are not able to help them.
That's almost like, that could also be the name of the book, right? Like, how do we, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's sometimes the way, I might start with a very broad frame, but then one approach really like, oh, this is such a rich approach. And sometimes it's happened that the approach becomes the whole topic. Yeah. And then we think about 3 ways of really kind of doing that approach. Right? And again, it goes back to what's your audience. Are you trying to the broadest possible audience, or are you saying that line between activism and deliberation, right? Sometimes you're saying, hey, let's sometimes I work with individual groups that already care about the issue, right? And they're just trying to figure out how do we act together, right? So this model can still be very useful for a group of, to work with just the choir, right? But for the choir to kind of help identify their actions.
Arm the choir, as I call it. Arm the choir.
Yeah, arming the choir, kind of helping those task teams and those type of things. Right?
Well, so we have national policy moving toward ending homelessness by providing them homes and support services. Yep. Then you have communities who are criminalizing it, including Houston.
Right. So that would be an option.
And so, if we continue, so there are actually policies that are going against each other.
Yeah.
Criminalizing is, more people get their mental health care in the county jail than they do in the pre-world clinics.
Yeah.
So that tells you about something about the population, just overcrowding. Versus people getting their needs sufficiently is the most efficient way. More reasons, financial line.
Other people think of, like Housing First, we talked about it yesterday, right? That might be an approach. One approach is like, hey, just put them in house, that idea of just giving them some sort of place to live. even if you're giving it to them, right, tends to be cheaper in the long run, right? So housing first has always been an option. With issues like this, a lot of times you might have an approach that really focuses on prevention, right? We really need to put our energy in kind of, those people that are almost homeless, right, or those type of things, right? Put our energy there, kind of more of a long-term strategy. Part of the approach might be more of like really look at the root causes, right? So you might say, mental health is really the cause of a lot of this chronic homelessness, right? So, focus on mental health kind of resources in some senses, right? Or, maybe you're saying the underlying cause is really about low wages, right? So saying, to really fix homelessness, if we really deal with homelessness, we're dealing with a symptom. The true cause of all this is just kind of the inequality in society and kind of the balance between the cost of living and the cost of housing and the cost of housing and wages. So that's what we need to fit. So you start kind of figuring out, in some ways, like, to what do we agree? Do we incorporate the business person's kind of perspective or the kind of the criminalizing thing? I think it'd be hard to make that an approach because people would just dump on that, right? So that would probably be something that, as I'm designing it, that's a perspective that I think about. How does that perspective respond to each approach? To what degree does this approach kind of work with those concerns in a way? To what degree does this approach get the homeless off the streets and kind of help beautify our county and like that? So instead of making an approach saying, get rid of them so we can be pretty, which wouldn't be very rich, right? But I know, hey, if we want to engage those audiences, that their opinion has to be in there, right? So some of that, so how do you kind of weave that? So some concerns you weave across the approaches, right? And then some concerns become the approach itself. You're trying to get into.
Just that before 1980, government practices and business practices, there were some changes there. So a lot of the people that we see in the homeless in the last 30 years, they managed. They were pretty invisible, or they, so there was something about the business practices that triggered, this population. And, I'm looking at the courts. The legal is kind of considered part of that as well. The healthcare, access to
both the mental. Like I know in Fort Collins, we don't have a detox, right? So we don't have much treatment programs for substance abuse, and that kind of goes with that mental health kind of stuff, right? So what policy changes happened? A lot of stuff happened during Ronald Reagan, right? That a lot of the funding to mental health kind of ended. So that will kind of trigger that initial homelessness. So you start kind of, is it organized by those core causes in the background? Is it organized by, we could probably kind of play with framing it in terms of key players, right? But like really kind of, I know our religious, our churches are involved somewhat, but there's a really big push in Denver, actually internationally now. There's this notion that there's more churches in the world than there is homeless people. So if every church took in one homeless person, there would be no homelessness. Right? So that's been a powerful statistic, especially in the United States. So Denver's been pushing that particularly. Like if every single church just did what it takes to get one homeless person off the streets, there would be no homeless, right? And that was kind of been a big charge that a lot of the churches have taken seriously in a way, right? So you could have an approach of really just kind of, nonprofits really have to step up here. And the second approach of local government needs to kind of, change policies in a way. And then I don't know what a third one kind of might be in that, right?
Kind of absorbing, just anticipating, when people fall, that to see where they get back up.
One thing that is really important in this is like doing the homework and finding out, like for me, homeless, the first thing that comes to mind, who are they? Because I know there are families, but I don't know how many families. I know some, they say veterans. Well, how many are out there? Because I don't know. Mentally ill people who, that I think that without doing the research to really build the background is really impossible to do.
And that's where you're bouncing back and forth, right? So that's what I was saying. You kind of start with the public to kind of see how they're talking about it, but then you're checking with the experts. So like one thing I think was happening this weekend is Fort Collins is doing their count, right? This point in time study that they have about 40 volunteers that are going all over the community to try to talk to every single homeless person to see what, they have a questionnaire with about 20 questions now. To what degree they're going to answer them truthfully or not. And I'm sure it's obviously self-reported data, but it's exactly that, right? And that's part of that cycle in a sense, right? So we want to balance and we want to find the right balance. And not necessarily half and half, but balance the expert data and the public data, because both can kind of inform each other in some ways. right? So once we're developing these, a lot of times, and that's why if I develop a framework kind of from the public concerns and public ideas, I might take it to the experts, right? So we take it to the Water Institute of CSU and say, hey, are we getting this right? Or often I'm working with the expert. But oftentimes things are framed so much from the expert perspective that the public can't engage with, right? So a lot of the work I do, I tend to start with the public and then I have the expert help me refine it. And if I'm getting something wrong or the public getting something wrong, we deal with it then in some ways. But yeah, I agree with you. We do need to know those numbers, right?
And
We
you
do
know,
need to know. I mean, how many poor, I remember the meeting last week, the park ranger got up and everyone was talking about how horrible that there's families and these young children that are sleeping at night. That's just ridiculous. The park ranger got up and said, I'm dealing with homeless every day. It's like, I haven't seen a child. Right? All the homeless I'm dealing with are older men. I've never seen a family, and I've never seen a child that's camping. What I've seen, there's homeless families, but they're the ones that tend to use the shelters, and they tend to, find someplace to stay. That there's at least in Fort Collins, there's very few families that are actually going to be on the street, right? And that was the conversation for a while kind of started focusing on children, and there was this uproar of like, oh my goodness, there's an 8-year-old sleep on the streets, and then finally the experts kind of said, no, actually that doesn't happen, right? We do have emergency shelters that. So you do need that clarity to kind of think about. And one of the approaches might be, a lot of the property stuff that I've done is like, let's make sure those that need help the most get the help, right? Whether that's disabled, whether that's children, whether that's family, right? But then part of that approach might be kind of the distinction of, the ones that aren't asking for help, right? Maybe we don't spend our time on there, right? That to what degree should you have an approach that really kind of tries to make that distinction between who's really deserving and who might not be as important to kind of focus on in some ways. But yeah, no, I completely agree that the data has to come into it, right? So this deliberative. Now, for a student assignment, again, it depends on how long you want the assignment to be, right? If it's a whole semester assignment, you're going to require a lot of research, right? But if it's more of a philosophical kind of assignment to kind of think through how you change the conversation, it might not be as much expert kind of stuff. But a lot of my work, it goes back to that Venn diagram I had. We have decision makers, the public, and experts, right? And we're in the middle. And I'm trying to design framings that do all three, right? That incorporate the public values and the public assumptions and public beliefs, incorporates the good data, but also incorporates the realities of, if something's completely unfeasible, I don't want it to be part of it anyway, right? And you're constantly bouncing back and forth between those three.